Welcome to another episode of Spotlight Murder by Skoob. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving deep into one of the most heartbreaking stories in entertainment history. The tragic tale of Bobbi Kristina Brown. Picture this: March 4th, 1993, Livingston, New Jersey. A baby girl is born who would never experience a moment of anonymity. From her very first breath, Bobbi Kristina Brown was destined for the spotlight, and perhaps, tragically, for the shadows that come with it. This wasn't just any child, this was music royalty incarnate. Her mother, Whitney Houston, arguably one of the greatest voices ever recorded, a woman whose rendition of "I Will Always Love You" still gives people chills today. Her father, Bobby Brown, the bad boy of R&B, who dominated the charts in the 80s and 90s. But the musical lineage ran even deeper. Her grandmother, Cissy Houston, was a gospel legend in her own right, and family connections stretched to icons like Dionne Warwick. Imagine growing up where red carpets were your playground, where Grammy Awards ceremonies were family gatherings, and where your mother's voice could fill stadiums with tens of thousands of adoring fans. Little Bobbi Kristina would toddle alongside Whitney on stage, appearing at award shows, basking in the glow of her mother's unprecedented success. But here's the thing about being born into royalty. Whether it's the British throne or the throne of American music, you inherit not just the crown, but everything that comes with it. The expectations, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, and yes, sometimes the curses that seem to follow certain bloodlines. Even as a small child, people weren't just seeing Bobbi Kristina Brown. They were seeing Whitney Houston's daughter, Bobbi Brown's daughter, the next generation of musical greatness the world was watching, waiting to see if lightning could strike twice, if those incredible genes would produce another superstar. She showed early promise, appearing on camera with the kind of natural charisma that suggested she might indeed be destined for her own spotlight. But as we'll discover, inheriting fame is like inheriting a loaded gun. It can protect you or it can destroy you, depending on how it's handled. Now, if this were a fairy tale, Bobbi Kristina's story would be one of seamless succession from one generation of greatness to the next. But this isn't a fairy tale. This is real life, and real life for the Houston Brown family was far more complicated than the glossy magazine photos suggested. Behind the scenes, Whitney and Bobbi's marriage was unraveling in spectacular fashion. We're talking about a relationship that became tabloid fodder, where private arguments became public spectacles, the very qualities that made them magnetic performers. The passion, the intensity, the raw emotion, these same qualities were tearing their relationship apart. And caught right in the middle of this storm, a young Bobbi Kristina watching her parents' love story turn into a cautionary tale played out for the world to see. The media didn't just report on Whitney and Bobbi's problems. They dissected them, analyzed them, turned their pain into entertainment for millions. Then came the reality show that would expose even more of the family's private struggles to public consumption. Being Bobbi Brown premiered when Bobbi Kristina was just entering her teenage years. Those crucial formative years when most kids are trying to figure out who they are away from their parents. But for Bobbi Kristina, there was no away from her parents. Their dysfunction was broadcast into living rooms across America. Viewers got an unfiltered look at the chaos, the arguments, the substance abuse issues that were plaguing both Whitney and Bobbi. And there was teenage Bobbi Kristina trying to navigate adolescence while cameras captured her family's most vulnerable moments. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was watching her relationship with her mother during these tumultuous years. Despite everything, despite the addiction, despite the media circus, despite the family drama, Bobbi Kristina remained fiercely loyal to Whitney. She defended her mother publicly, stood by her side through scandal after scandal. This loyalty, this deep, almost symbiotic bond between mother and daughter would become both Bobbi Kristina's greatest strength and, ultimately, her greatest vulnerability. Because when you love someone that intensely, when your identity becomes so intertwined with theirs, what happens when that person is suddenly gone? February 11th, 2012. Remember where you were when you heard the news? I do. It was one of those moments that stopped the world. Whitney Houston, the voice of a generation, found dead in a hotel bathtub at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles. She was only 48 years old, but while the world mourned a legend, one person's entire universe completely collapsed. Bobbi Kristina Brown, just 18 years old, didn't just lose a mother that day. She lost her best friend, her protector, her entire reason for being. The night before Whitney died, Bobbi Kristina had asked her mother to stay with her. They spent that final night together, Bobbi Kristina sleeping in her mother's arms. Can you imagine the innocence of that moment? A teenager who still needed her mom's comfort, still found safety in those protective arms that had held her since birth. When morning came and Whitney was gone, Bobbi Kristina's reaction was raw and devastating. She later told Oprah Winfrey about that surreal moment of waking up and calling out, "Mom?" as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just shifted permanently off its axis. But the real trauma happened at the Beverly Hilton Hotel itself. Picture this scene. Emergency responders, police officers, hotel staff, media gathering like vultures. And in the middle of all this chaos, an 18-year-old girl demanding to see her mother's body, becoming hysterical when she was turned away. This was her mama, her everything, and she couldn't even say goodbye properly. Friends described her as inconsolable in those first hours after Whitney's death. She required medical attention, such was the intensity of her grief and shock. This wasn't just sadness, this was a complete psychological break from a reality she couldn't accept. In her interview with Oprah months later, Bobbi Kristina tried to put words to the impossible. She talked about how she still felt her mother's presence, how Whitney's spirit would pass through me all the time. She called her mother my everything. And when your everything is suddenly gone, what's left of you, the most heartbreaking part? Bobbi Kristina described how grief would ambush her. She could be laughing one moment, seeming fine to the outside world, and then suddenly a wave of loss would crash over her, leaving her drowning in sorrow all over again. Now, in the middle of this unimaginable grief, enter Nick Gordon, a young man whose presence in Bobbi Kristina's life would become the source of endless controversy and, ultimately, tragedy. Here's where the story gets really complicated. Nick Gordon wasn't some random boyfriend who swept Bobbi Kristina off her feet. He had been living in the Houston household since he was 12 years old, raised essentially as Whitney's foster son, though never formally adopted. For years, he and Bobbi Kristina had grown up together as siblings. But when Whitney died, something shifted. The grief-stricken 18-year-old, who had just lost her anchor in the world, suddenly began leaning on the one person who understood her family dynamics, who had also lost Whitney as a mother figure. Within months of Whitney's death, their sibling-like relationship transformed into something romantic, and the Houston and Brown families were horrified. Think about the psychology here for a moment. Bobbi Kristina had just experienced the most devastating loss imaginable. She was vulnerable, inheriting millions from her mother's estate, and desperately seeking someone to fill that enormous void in her life. Nick Gordon stepped right into that space. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The family immediately sensed something was wrong. Sissy Houston, Bobbi Kristina's grandmother, voiced strong disapproval of Gordon. Bobbi Brown publicly stated that while the couple claimed to be married, they were never legally husband and wife. Family members warned Bobbi Kristina about Gordon's intentions, especially concerning her inheritance. Yet Bobbi Kristina was completely dependent on him. He became her protector, her confidant, her whole world, which sounds romantic until you realize how effectively he was isolating her from her support system. Classic signs of a controlling relationship were emerging, but she was too grief-stricken and too young to recognize the red flags. On social media, they projected this perfect love story, posting romantic photos, declaring their eternal devotion to each other. But friends and family members were painting a very different picture behind closed doors. They described Gordon as manipulative, abusive, and primarily interested in Bobbi Kristina's money. The tragic irony? In trying to fill the void left by her mother's death, Bobbi Kristina may have chosen the very person who would ultimately contribute to her own destruction. January 31st, 2015. Almost 3 years to the day after Whitney Houston's death, history repeated itself in the most chilling way imaginable. That morning in Alpharetta, Georgia, Nick Gordon and a friend discovered Bobbi Kristina Brown face down and unresponsive in a bathtub. The parallels to her mother's death were so striking, so eerily similar, that investigators immediately suspected this was more than just a tragic coincidence. Gordon and his friend attempted CPR while waiting for emergency responders, but the damage was already done. Bobbi Kristina had suffered severe brain damage due to oxygen deprivation from drowning, and when she arrived at North Fulton Hospital in Roswell, Georgia, doctors delivered the devastating news to her family. A meaningful recovery was highly unlikely. For nearly 6 months, Bobbi Kristina remained in an induced coma while her family held on to hope that defied all medical evidence. Can you imagine Bobby Brown, having already lost the mother of his child, now watching helplessly as his daughter fought for her life in a hospital bed? The man later said that telling his daughter to let her mom go was the hardest thing he ever had to do, but now he was facing an even more impossible situation. The media attention was intense and immediate. Here was Whitney Houston's daughter, found in the circumstances almost identical to her mother's death, and the public was both heartbroken and fascinated by the tragic pattern emerging in this family. During those 6 months, legal battles began to emerge that would reveal the true nature of Bobbi Kristina's relationship with Nick Gordon. Her estate filed a $10 million civil lawsuit against Gordon, accusing him of causing her injuries through domestic violence and exploiting her financially while she was unconscious and unable to protect herself. The allegations were shocking, that Gordon had physically abused her, punching her and knocking out her tooth, that he had controlled her money and manipulated her completely. Friends came forward to corroborate these claims, describing a relationship characterized by Gordon's dominance and abuse, where he systematically pushed other people out of Bobbi Kristina's life. On July 26, 2015, after nearly 6 months of hoping against hope, Bobbi Kristina Brown died at the age of 22. The world had lost another member of music royalty, but more tragically, the world had witnessed the destruction of a young woman who never really got the chance to live her own life, to step out from under the shadows of fame and family tragedy. When someone dies under mysterious circumstances, especially someone as high profile as Bobbi Kristina Brown, the autopsy becomes crucial not just for legal purposes, but for public understanding. The Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an extensive forensic investigation that would reveal the tragic final chapter of her story. The official cause of death was lobar pneumonia, resulting from brain damage due to oxygen deprivation after water immersion. But here's where it gets complicated and heartbreaking. The autopsy also revealed mixed drug intoxication involving alcohol, marijuana, cocaine-related compounds, benzodiazepines, and morphine. Let me break this down for you. The combination of substances found in Bobbi Kristina's system tells a story of someone who is likely struggling with multiple forms of substance abuse. The mixture of alcohol and benzodiazepines alone is incredibly dangerous. Both are central nervous system depressants that can impair consciousness and motor skills. Add opioids like morphine to that mix, and you have a potentially lethal combination that could leave someone unable to respond in an emergency situation. The cocaine-related compounds indicated recent use, which may have further stressed her cardiovascular and neurological systems. This wasn't just recreational drug use. This was a dangerous cocktail that suggested someone who was either engaging in extremely risky behavior or was in such emotional pain that the risks didn't matter anymore. Here's what's particularly tragic about these findings. They paint a picture of a young woman who was essentially drowning in substances long before she was found in that bathtub. The drugs likely impaired her ability to save herself when she got into trouble in the water, turning what might have been a survivable accident into a fatal tragedy. But here's the crucial detail that has kept conspiracy theories alive. The manner of death was officially classified as undetermined. The medical examiner couldn't conclude whether her death was accidental or intentional. This classification doesn't suggest foul play by another person. Rather, it acknowledges that they couldn't determine if Bobbi Kristina had intended to harm herself or if this was a tragic accident. The forensic investigation also examined the scene itself, the positioning of her body, the water level in the tub, the surrounding environment. They found no conclusive evidence that another person directly caused her injuries, despite the ongoing legal battle with Nick Gordon. While criminal investigators couldn't find enough evidence to charge Nick Gordon with a crime, the civil court system told a very different story. And this is where we finally get some answers about what really happened in the months and years leading up to Bobbi Kristina's death. In 2016, a civil court found Nick Gordon legally responsible for Bobbi Kristina Brown's wrongful death, by default, because he failed to appear in court to defend himself. But the evidence presented during these proceedings painted a horrifying picture of abuse, control, and exploitation. The lawsuit alleged that Gordon had been physically violent with Bobbi Kristina, including punching her and knocking out her tooth. But the abuse wasn't just physical, it was financial and emotional as well. According to the allegations, Gordon had systematically gained control over her money, manipulating someone who was already vulnerable due to grief and substance abuse. Think about the timeline here. Bobbi Kristina inherited a substantial portion of Whitney Houston's estate. She was young, traumatized, and desperately seeking someone to depend on Gordon, who had grown up in her household and understood the family dynamics intimately, was perfectly positioned to take advantage of her vulnerability. The civil court awarded a massive financial judgment against Gordon, though collecting on such judgments can be notoriously difficult. More importantly, the legal findings validated what many family members and friends had suspected all along, that Nick Gordon had been a destructive force in Bobbi Kristina's life, rather than the loving partner he claimed to be. What makes this even more tragic is that the people who loved Bobbi Kristina most, her father, Bobby Brown, her grandmother, Cissy Houston, had seen the danger and tried to warn her. But when someone is in the grip of grief, trauma, and potentially addiction, they often can't see clearly enough to protect themselves. The legal victory was hollow, of course. No amount of money could bring Bobbi Kristina back, and no court judgment could undo the years of alleged abuse and manipulation she had endured. But it did provide some measure of accountability, and perhaps helped her family feel that her story had been heard, and her suffering acknowledged. Nick Gordon himself died in 2020 from a drug overdose, taking whatever secrets he might have held about Bobbi Kristina's final days with him to the grave. When two members of the same family die under strikingly similar circumstances within 3 years of each other, conspiracy theories are inevitable. And in the case of Whitney Houston and Bobbi Kristina Brown, the theories have run the gamut from plausible to completely outlandish. Let's start with the most obvious parallel. Both mother and daughter were found unresponsive in bathtubs with drugs in their systems. Whitney Houston died from accidental drowning with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. Bobbi Kristina died from brain damage due to oxygen deprivation from water immersion, compounded by multiple substances. The similarities are undeniably eerie. Some theorists have suggested that this couldn't be mere coincidence, that someone must have orchestrated both deaths. These theories often focus on Nick Gordon, suggesting that he might have had knowledge of Whitney's death circumstances and deliberately recreated them. While there's no credible evidence supporting this theory, the legal findings about Gordon's alleged abuse of Bobbi Kristina have given these conspiracies some staying power. Other theories have focused on the entertainment industry itself, suggesting that both women were victims of some kind of systematic targeting of successful black artists. These theories often incorporate other celebrity deaths, creating elaborate conspiracies involving record labels, industry executives, or even government agencies. Again, there's no credible evidence for these claims, but they reflect a broader suspicion about the pressures and dangers faced by high-profile entertainers. Then there are the more supernatural theories, that the family was cursed, or that Bobbi Kristina was somehow destined to follow in her mother's footsteps. While these theories might seem far-fetched, they speak to something very real: the way trauma, addiction, and family dysfunction can create patterns that repeat across generations. The more mundane reality is probably the most tragic of all. Both Whitney and Bobbi Kristina were struggling with substance abuse in environments where they were surrounded by enablers rather than people who could effectively help them. Both were dealing with intense public scrutiny, family pressures, and personal relationships that may have been more harmful than supportive. The official investigations have consistently found no evidence of foul play in either death, but the repeated pattern of similar circumstances has left a lasting impression on the public consciousness and continues to fuel speculation about whether these tragedies could have been prevented. In all of this tragedy, one figure has often been overlooked: Bobbi Brown, the father who had to bury both the mother of his child and his daughter within 3 years. The man who once dominated the charts with hits like "My Prerogative" found himself facing every parent's worst nightmare, and he was facing it in the public eye. Bobbi Brown has been remarkably candid about his grief and his regrets. He's spoken about how telling his daughter to let her mom go was the most difficult thing he ever had to do. But then finding himself in the position of having to let go of his daughter as well was almost beyond human endurance. But rather than retreating from public life, Bobbi Brown has chosen to transform his family's tragedy into something that might help others. He established the Bobbi Kristina Serenity House, which provides support for victims of domestic violence. This initiative directly addresses one of the issues that may have contributed to his daughter's death: the abusive relationship she was allegedly trapped in with Nick Gordon. He's also become an advocate for addiction awareness and mental health support, recognizing that both Whitney and Bobbi Kristina might still be alive if they had received different kinds of help at crucial moments in their lives. This advocacy work represents a father's attempt to ensure that his family's suffering serves some greater purpose. The establishment of these support systems reflects Bobbi Brown's understanding that fame and wealth aren't enough to protect someone from domestic violence, addiction, or mental health crises. His daughter had access to the best medical care money could buy, but she didn't have access to the kind of intervention that might have saved her life. There's something both heartbreaking and inspiring about watching Bobbi Brown channel his grief into action. He could have become bitter, could have retreated from the world that seemed to have taken everything from him. Instead, he chose to honor his daughter's memory by trying to help other young people who might be facing similar struggles. Thanks for joining this episode on Gag Play. Gags raise real risks. They're not toys. Always agree on clear nonverbal safety signals, practice them off-scene, and never leave a gagged partner alone. Stop if breathing feels tight, if anyone is nauseous or congested, or if something feels wrong. Prioritize quick removal and constant monitoring. Remember, the power of gag play is psychological. Surrendering voice builds trust and intimacy. Treat it with care, respect, and consent. Curious about real stories and step-by-step safety setups we didn't cover here? Hear the full case studies and demos, including emergency removal techniques, inside. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story.